Hello there everyone, I'm Christina of CSLdesigns, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this Josephine Knot wirework bracelet with beads. Now we are only using one length of wire for this whole bracelet, and the beads are placed between the knots to kind of separate them and add a bit of colour. So if you want to learn how to make it, then keep watching. So these are the materials that we're going to need, and all we need is our wire and our beads, and the wire that I'm using here is a 0.8mm round copper wire. Now if you end up struggling a little bit with this wire, you can always change the gauge to a thinner wire, so it makes it a little bit easier to work with. Just be aware that it will also be less sturdy. Now the beads that I'm using are these 4mm rounds, but you can really play around with these, so use different sizes and shapes. It's completely up to you. But don't forget to check out the description box below the video for any links you might need. Otherwise, let's get all the materials ready and let's get started. And then we need a length of a wire here of about 1.4 meter, and this is going to be used for the whole bracelet. So the first thing I'm doing is taking my wire here and then putting the ends together, because we need to find the midpoint, because that's what we're going to start from. So we end up having two lengths of wire to work with. So I'm just slowly getting down towards the midpoint here. You can see we then just have kind of a loop. And you just want to gradually kind of make that smaller and smaller. So you don't want to completely push them together, but just make a nice little loop here. And this is going to be a starting point and also the midpoint. Now this loop is going to be used as part of the clasp, so we're kind of making that straight away. So just get it in place, and then we have our lengths here to work with. So just make sure that they're nice and straightened out. They don't have to be perfectly straight, but just make sure there's no kinks in them, and make sure that throughout as well. Just keep running them through your fingers and hands to smooth them out, and also get rid of any possible kinks and bends that will occur as we're making the piece, but just keep smoothing it out. So we have our loop here. You can also use a mandrel of some sort or some pliers if you want this a certain size and shape. It's completely up to you, but you can equally just do it like this using your fingers. So now we need to straight away go in to start making our very first knot. So it is a little bit fiddly because mainly this is working with wire. Now if we made these knots with cord, it would be substantially easier, because obviously cord you can bend and shape how you want to and it won't affect it, whereas the wire here, you can't do that in the same way. So once you put it into a shape, it will prefer to stay like that, and it will be hard to kind of change that, but just do it gradually and slowly. And like I said, you can also use a different gauge, a thinner gauge wire, either just to make it with or even to practice with first, and then you can always move up to a thicker gauge once you're comfortable. So on to making our first knot. What we're going to do, it doesn't matter what side you start with really, it's just whatever comes natural to you. Just keep repeating the same thing throughout. I'm going to start with, just in this case, the wire that's furthest away. Like I said, it doesn't really matter. But what I'm going to do is take that wire by itself first of all, and we want to create a loop with that. So keep this initial little loop shape in place, kind of hold on to it, and then I'm going to bring this wire that I'm working with over the other one, making sure I keep that size loop that I want, and then gradually bring it over and continue bring it back around to basically create a loop with this itself for now, so it overlaps itself. Something a little bit like this, making sure I come back down the same direction the wire was coming before. So we've ended up with something like this. So that's basically the first half of the knot. Now that's the easy part. The difficult part with this being wire is the other half of it. So that's basically repeating this, we need to make an equivalent loop with the other wire, the other side, but we need to weave it in and out, and that's the difficult part. So I'm just starting something like this, and also this is the point, by the way, where you need to decide what size you want your knots to be. So obviously there's going to be kind of a minimum for how small you can make them, but you can really do what you want to, however large you want them to be, or how open or how tight, that's up to you. Obviously to the point where you can't make them any tighter because of the wire itself. Now what I'm going to be working with as well is a pair of chain nose pliers. I find that quite handy to help shaping the wire how we want it, where we want it to go. Because like I said, we can't just rely on the wire working in the same way as if we were using cord. So then to create the loop on the other side, making sure the first loop that we just made there is laying above it. So this wire that I'm now working with is coming below that loop. And I'm just gonna bring it over towards the other side a little bit. So basically it comes underneath the loop, but more or less in the middle there of it. And then I want to grab my chain nose pliers, because I like to I find it best to prepare this before we start weaving in and out. It makes it easier and it gives a better final result, I find, because like I said, this does not react the same way as cord will. So what I do is I lay the wires in place where they're going to be sitting. Remember as well the loop here. Now don't worry too much, because we can always reshape that afterwards by putting mandrel or something in there, or pliers. But I'm placing the wire underneath the loop. Then I'm going to take my chain nose pliers here, grab onto that wire that we're working with, just before kind of the mid part of it there, where it would be inside of the loop. Then what I'm going to do is start bending this upwards. You can open them up a little bit from each other. Start bending it upward a bit. So you can see there it goes towards the loop. And then I move to kind of the other side of that midpoint. And then I bend it back down. So now we've created almost like a little hill there, you could say, which is then actually going to end up fitting perfectly into that loop that we already made, so in the middle of that. And the reason I'm doing that is because that prepares for this wire that we're currently working with to come back around. As you can see, the first loop that we made, it overlaps. That's what it's going to do down here. And the best way of doing that, I find, is to prepare the wire. Now I'm just taking the end and straightening it back out, because what we then want it to do is go over the other wire, because we need to make sure basically everything is going over, under, over, under. That's how the knot is made. So start bringing it over there. Just take your time. Try and then make sure, obviously, as well, as much as you can, keep everything symmetrical as you go. Now, what I find help as well is this wire here that we're currently going over. That's coming from the first loop that we made. I push that down a little bit, because then that makes it easier to bring this wire around. Try and keep then the loop that we're creating now, try and make that as even to the other one as possible. Now as we're getting around here, you need to get right to the end. It's the most fiddly while the wires are this long, obviously, especially at the first knot here as well. As you're making more knots, obviously the wires will get shorter and it becomes easier and easier. You haven't got as long lengths to work with. But then I'm taking the end, and we've already gone over the other wire. Now I need to come underneath the next one, which then means coming through the loop here. Now just pull the wire gently all the way through. I like to kind of grab hold of everything else while I'm doing that. Just spin your piece around however you need to. Get the long length here with you and see where we are. So obviously I'm wanting to keep that kind of, you could say, bend or little hill that I made fitting with that first loop. So I then want this wire to come around and now create that second loop, as you can start to see. And obviously we do want this to be ideally a similar size or same size as possible as the other one. Now what you can also do is you can use your pliers throughout to help maneuver your wire. Now be careful, because obviously you want these to be loops and to have curves, so you don't want to grab onto anything too tight and flatten it out, but just you can help kind of grab onto your wire and maneuver it along the way, because it can be much easier to get into the little spaces rather than using your fingers. So as you can see, I feel like I need to kind of bring this one over a bit more to then be able to tighten up the loop a little bit. So if I bring that over, we can start to more see it now. Just need a little bit more here. Tighten it just a tad more. Something a bit like that, you can start to see it. Now obviously this wire that we're working with now is kind of just coming out from this side of the knot and just sticking out. What we need is for this to weave through the very first loop that we made. So that is the final part now, which is also the most fiddly part I find, but that is where I made that initial little hill to come up through the loop to help it along a bit. So get it in place. I find that if you're more or less happy with the loop here, this wire that I'm working with, make sure you're happy with it, pushing it against the wire like this, so it kind of is sticking out, helps to then take the end and bring it down through that first loop, but on this side of the little hill, so currently the side that's closest to the initial loop. So just the side that's closest to where the wire is naturally coming from. Now this is the part that's fiddly, getting this through, because it's going to want to kind of put everything out of shape. So just take your time and gently do it best you can. And you can see your wire will get a bit out of shape here. So just gently maneuver it, and you can see on this side it went a little bit deformed compared to how it was. So that's where you can just again take pliers, especially in a case like this. It's easier to take the pliers and use, because it will also help reshape it. Anything that, because you can see you wouldn't be able to get your fingers in there, so use your pliers for this, just to basically help get the wire in specific place that you want it to go. Now it's coming down through that loop, but it needs to come back up on the other side of that little hill and basically interlock with that. So I take my end, come up on the other side of it, but still inside of that initial loop, slowly bring it through. And then I like to try my best to hold on to everything here with my fingers while I'm then gently pulling this wire through. Because again, because this is pretty thick wire, it will be tough to do that, because it naturally doesn't want to do it. Like say it would be easy to do that with cord. But then pull that up through, and you can then see that fits in perfectly with that little hill that we made. And it makes it more intertwined and interlocked with each other as well, like it would be if it was cord. And then while I'm here, I just want to smooth out my wire. So run it through my fingers and then have a little look at it. Then I take my wire here and we need to bring it back down a bit, so the whole knot obviously ends up being flat. So we can have a little look, see if there's anything that we want to adjust, because any adjustments I recommend doing while you're in that knot. So I can see I do want to just tighten up this knot a little bit. So you can take your pliers again, because basically if it was cord you will be able to just hold on to the knot and then pull on this length a bit, but you can't really do that because it's the wire, because it's pretty much locked in place now. So just take your pliers and gradually force it into a little bit more of the place where you want it to be. If you need to tighten any loop or just change the shape of anything. I also think we want to open up that loop a little bit. Then just do that until you're happy with it. And once you're happy with your knot here, you can see it looks like this. Then what we need to do is just make sure that these wires are basically in position for the next step. So I like to kind of just hold it sideways like this. I hold onto the knot with my fingers, and then I just bring them down and then pull them out to basically come out away from the knot, both of them in the same direction. So straight out next to each other, something a bit like this. And then there we have the first knot in place, and the wires are in position for the next knot. Now before we make the next knot, this is the point where I'm going to add the beads and then use the beads to space between the knots. So before you add the beads, just make sure you run the wires through your fingers and you smooth them out along the way. So like I said, we avoid having any kinks there, because that might stop the beads from being able to go all the way down the wire, depending on the size of the holes obviously. But just smooth out your wires and then get to the ends here. Then grab your bead one at a time, and we're just adding one bead onto each wire. So first one and the second one, and then you just want to bring them all the way down to the knot. So basically they're going to sit just like that and be that little spacer in between the knots. So the knots obviously aren't sitting right literally next to each other, but also it adds that lovely pop of colour and sometimes sparkle as well. Now you have these to guide you for where to start the next knot. And obviously we want to make sure these beads now stay as close to that knot as possible. So make sure that when you start the next knot that they're not kind of moving down the wires. Want them to be as tight to that knot as possible. Now I'm holding my piece. All there is to this now is basically repeating what we've already done. We made the first knot, you want to start making the next knot in the exact same way. So I personally naturally start with that, in this case top wire with how I'm holding them. Bring that over the other one, and you start making that very first loop, bringing it all the way, making sure that that bead is nice and tight, making the first loop here. Now the goal is to, obviously, if you want them to be the same as much as possible, is to get this loop as close in size to the loops in the other knot there, the one that we just made before. So you just want to take a bit of time, and you can see in this case I need to make it a little bit smaller still. So just get it so you have the size that you're happy with. That's the first loop. And then that's where we take the other wire and start maneuvering it. Remember making that little hill first as it's going underneath the loop, then weaving it over, under, coming through, and then get through the loop here but underneath that hill that we made, and make sure to make this knot as close to those beads as possible. So basically this loop that we have here, make sure it gets up right underneath that bead, and then just repeat the same thing over and over, and then obviously remembering to add those beads in between as well until you reach the length that you want. So now I kept making my knots here and I've reached the other end, And then here, what I'm going to do is make the other part of the clasp. So because we already made the loop to begin with, this is then going to be the hook part. Now, after the very final knot that I made, I did add the beads in the same way, as you can see. And I've just done that so we have these beads in between the last knot and the hook part of the clasp, just to make it blend in nicely. So first of all, what I'm going to do is get these two ends closer to each other and then basically end up crossing over. So something a bit like this. So we have that crossover point. Then I'm going to grab my chain nose pliers here, and then we want to put a bend, because where that crossover point is more or less in the middle. I'm going to just put a bend into one and bring it back up so it goes straight out from the middle there. You can see it comes straight out. And then I'm going to use the other length to wrap around, literally where that bend is, and then do a couple wraps. Make them nice and tight. Use your pliers to help you if you need to. So we just need a couple of wraps for it to be secure. And then I'm going to go in and cut off the excess. And make sure to just flatten that down, that little end of the wire, like that. And then just want to push my wraps nice and tight together here. And then we're left with this one length, and that's the wire we're going to make the hook with. So it's up to you really how large you want the hook. So I'm going to go out a certain length, a few centimeters really, and then basically the length that you go out is going to be about half that length the hook is going to be. And I'm putting my bracelet into my pliers sideways there. And then bring the end all the way around the pliers. So it comes down next to itself. Now it's pretty open here. What I want to do is tighten this up. So almost as if we're making a prong. You can see, bringing the wires closer together and really tightening up that bend. So there we go. Now I have my wires right next to each other. I want to move down towards where my wraps are from before, but just put my pliers a little bit above them so we have some space. And then I take the end up against my pliers and then start bending it over the other length. And you can see I have a little bit of space there between where my pliers and that wire is, and then where the wraps from before are. And you then just go in and fill in that space with this length until it can't go any further. And then take your cutters again, cut off the excess, and again make sure to just flatten that down so it's going to be nice and comfortable to wear. And then all that's left to do is just shape the hook. Now I'm just using these bell making pliers, 6-step bell making pliers. I'm placing them in roughly about the middle, just a little bit below, and then pushing the very end back on itself around the pliers, so I end up with this almost hook shape here. And now I like to just take my chain nose pliers, grab the very end, last couple of millimeters there where we have the bend, and then just bend that back outwards. So there we now have the final hook shape. And that is now the other end of the bracelet made. And all that's then left to do now is shape this so we can obviously wear it. So I just like to take my fingers here, go in and start putting a curve into it nicely. Just gradually, so don't go into one place and make a big bend. Just gradually put a curve going from side to side. And obviously the aim is to get the two ends to be getting closer and closer together so we can end up using the clasp. Just keep going like this until you have the shape. And it looks a little something like this. So we can now use the clasp. And the bracelet is ready to wear. So that's how you make this Josephine Knot wirework bracelet, just using one length of wire and some beads. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and you like these bracelets. Now if you do decide to make any of them yourself, I would love to see them if you want to share, so you can always tag me on social media. Links to everywhere you can find me is going to be in the description box down below. But I will say Instagram is definitely my main one. But otherwise, like I said, I really hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching it, and I'll see you in the next one.